Hi, and welcome back to the Dr. Sylvia K Show. I'm Dr. Sylvia K. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist with a PhD in family therapy, and I am here to serve you through YouTube, through this video podcast, but most of all, I am here to inspire you. I'm here to share wisdom that I've learned along the way. And most of all, I am here to help you feel just a little less alone in this very busy and stressful world. So today I decided to get really personal and use this episode as a way to reintroduce myself, but to reintroduce myself on a much personal level, to share my personal story, who I am, where I come from, what I've been through, how I decided to become a therapist. And in all of this, especially in this episode, I want to weave in the power of narrative psychology. I want to weave in tools that I think can help you reframe your story to bring understanding to a dominant story that has most likely been impacting the way you see yourself and others. And a dominant story is basically a story we tell ourselves that was based on a problem that we faced at a young age. And most of us internalize that problem and somehow identified that problem as a part of us. So we shaped our identity, we shaped who we are and how we see ourselves and how we see the world around that problem. So using narrative psychology today, I want to help you identify what some of those original problems were, and then help you externalize, separate your identity, who you are, your essence, and the infinite possibilities of what you can do and how you can show up in this world, to separate that from this initial problem that impacted you at a young age or maybe at a different part of your life. And so the goal of separating yourself from this problem, externalizing the problem, is to give you more emotional freedom, is to give you more possibilities, to give you more choices in terms of your behaviors, and most important, in how you react to certain situations. And ultimately, just to develop more self mastery, more self awareness, and an understanding of who you are so that you can take accountability and responsibility for the things that you're sensitive towards, the vulnerabilities that you have, and empower yourself so that with this knowledge of understanding your dominant story, separating your personality, your essence, who you are from that dominant story, developing more self awareness, self mastery, developing flexibility of mind, emotional freedom, you can start showing up for yourself in a much more empowered way. And you can start showing up in your relationships in a much more authentic way so that you're not constantly, in a way, reliving the past by constantly getting triggered and reacting to those triggers in an old way based on that problem that you've internalized. So these tools will help you, in essence, show up more in the present. It will help free you from some emotional baggage that you've been carrying, perhaps even generationally. I do believe that we carry at least 3 generations of emotional programming. So, most likely, the trauma that your grandparents weren't able to process and the trauma that your parents weren't able to process, you most likely are carrying that in your genes, in your genetic activities, right? So, sometimes you might react or respond to a trigger in a way that surprises you. Maybe that's connected to some unprocessed trauma that your grandparents never had the tools or the ability or the knowledge to even process. So I'm trusting that if you have found my channel, most likely you are a generational cycle breaker. What does that mean? Well, when it comes to generational trauma, epigenetic shows that we carry at least 3 generations of emotional programming. So from your parents and your grandparents. And if you are a generational cycle breaker, you most likely are in a crossroads where you're becoming much more aware of the trauma that your family has faced generationally, and you are consciously choosing to respond to these triggers in a different way. You are consciously choosing to heal your own story so you don't have to keep repeating unprocessed responses. You don't have to continue repeating unprocessed trauma. You don't have to continue repeating unhealthy behavioral interactions that most likely you've observed and learned in your own family system. And it's not easy being a generational cycle breaker, because not only do you have to process your own, well, you don't have to, but you're invited to process your own emotional wounds, then you are held responsible responsible for consciously choosing new behaviors, new reactions. And that can be really hard, especially if some of your reactions are just conditioned. So, taking that accountability and responsibility for your own healing and breaking generational cycles and choosing new behavior that is based in the present moment, that's based on a version of you that wants to heal, that wants to evolve, that wants to treat yourself with respect and treat others with respect, that wants to experience a sense of emotional freedom and create a new cycle. My hat's off to you. It takes a lot of courage, it takes grit, it takes willingness, and it also takes support. I want you to feel less alone in this journey of being a generational cycle breaker. So, with all of that said, I am going to segue into reintroducing myself and telling you a little bit about my story. I'm going to weave in my own dominant story, certain things that happened in my life that were problems. I'm going to describe them first from a dominant story perspective and explain to you how I internalized those problems and they became a part of my personality. I'll also describe my journey through my master's program and how I used my master's in counseling psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute as a launchpad to really dive into self-awareness. I will describe also my experience in my PhD program at Nova Southeastern University in Davie, Florida, and describe how a relational approach to therapy and psychology really helped me not only understand my own responsibility in my healing, but helped me exit this over analysis that had often left to paralysis or just kind of led me to repeating old behaviors. So I will say one thing for my PhD program that has really impacted me both as a therapist and as a human. Insight does not change behavior. What do I mean by that? Just because you know your cues, just because you know your vulnerabilities, just because you know and understand your trauma, and you could be extremely educated in the world of self-awareness and therapy, just because you know why you do certain things will not change your behavior. Insight does not change behavior. Behavior changes behavior. So from a relational perspective, right? I have learned in my PhD program that when we broaden the context, all behavior makes sense. But it also requires new behavior to change old behavior. So this podcast is about increasing your insight, awareness, self-awareness, and knowledge, but also it's a nudge to start to learn new behaviors and apply these new behaviors to your life so that you can see the change that you want to see. I don't believe you'd be listening to this podcast if there wasn't some part of you that really wants to change, that wants to change maybe an aspect of your relationships, your personal relationships, maybe change an aspect of the way you feel or the way you show up in this world. Maybe there's a part of you that wants to change old behaviors, self-defeating behaviors, behaviors that often lead you to feeling worse. So with behavior change, right? Insight doesn't change behavior. Behavior changes behavior. So with the small little behavior changes that you will learn along the way in this podcast, I have 100% confidence and hope that it is going to support you in your own personal journey, in your own personal development, in your own personal journey through self-mastery to help you get to that place in your life where you really want to be, where you want to feel. Okay, so let's just do a quick recap on narrative psychology, and then I will bring in my personal story, and we'll go from there. So narrative psychology, this is a type of psychology that is going to help you understand this narrative that you've been telling yourself or about the world. And it's going to help you understand how certain problems in your life, most likely in your early childhood, made such an impact on your psyche, your mind and soul, that you developed this sense of self, the sense of an identity that was based on the problem. And you're most likely showing up in your relationships, still reacting from this hurt, still reacting from this dominant story that you internalized. Now, narrative psychology was first used in Australia and in New Zealand to work with young boys and girls that were in juvenile programs. And it was created by Michael White to really help broaden the context of these teenagers' behaviors, but to really empower these teenagers and help them understand that because they were the identified patient did not mean that they were the problem. Narrative psychology really helped these young teens who felt that they were bad, who felt that the world was against them, who felt abandoned by their parents, who felt let down by the system. It helped them gain a sense of hope and inspiration to see the problem separate, to take accountability for the problem, but also to not internalize it where they felt that no matter what they did, it wasn't going to make a difference. So it really helps narrative psychology, I think, with your self-esteem, but it also gives you that flexibility of mind to look at the problem differently so that you can free yourself from certain behaviors or ways of seeing yourself that were based on that problem. So I think the best way to teach this type of model of therapy is to share my personal story. And I think it is really storytelling where we connect. So whether you're watching me on YouTube through this video or you're listening through audio via Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I hope that through me sharing my story that you and I can connect. And maybe there are parts of my story that will resonate with parts of your life. And I hope in those moments where you can resonate with certain aspects of my story, whether it's the hurt or sense of abandonment or fear or the courage, that you can feel just a little less alone watching or listening to this podcast. So let me first present my dominant story, a problematic story, a story that was based on a problem. I would say problems, plural. And I'm first going to describe this dominant story in a way that I would describe it when I wasn't using narrative psychology, when I was still in my 20s. So I would describe this story based on these problems I experienced in my life. And then it started to create almost like a certain character. And it also impacted how people saw me. So the dominant story that I would tell sounds like this. So my mom and dad are Polish. They left Poland during the 70s, and they left because my father believed that there would be better opportunities abroad. He first wanted to go to Canada, and he felt that there would be better opportunities in Canada for his children to be raised in terms of education, freedom, because at the time, Poland was communist. Now, my mother and father decided to escape Poland with my brother, who was also born in Poland. And this was, I'm guessing this was around 1975 or 1976. Now, they decided to leave Poland, and their plan was they were going to tell their mom that they were going to come visit her in Torino. So my grandmother, who was Polish, was working in Torino. And my father said, okay, mom, I'm going to come visit you. I'm going to bring my wife and my son. We're going to spend 2 weeks with you. So they came to Torino. And when they left Poland, they were conscious that they weren't going to come back. So they packed 2 suitcases, left Poland, went to see my grandmother. When they left my grandmother after 2 weeks in Torino, Italy, they knew they weren't going back to Poland. They were going to find a way to get to England and then find a way from England to get from England to Canada. So as my father left Torino with my mom and my brother, my grandmother thought they were going back to Poland. Now, I think my father went through San Remo and then went through France and then ended up in England where his uncle was living. And he asked his uncle if he could stay with him. By this time, my grandmother figured out something was wrong and that they hadn't returned to Poland. Now, remember, Poland was communist at the time. So my grandmother was very upset, but also scared that what if her, right? What if she would be punished by the government, or my father, her son, would be in trouble? So it created a huge scandal. My grandmother told my uncle, do not house them. Do not take part of this. Do not enable their terrible choice. So again, a lot of this story are bits and pieces from my father telling me the story. So this is my dominant story based on a dominant story that my father told me. So then my father somehow found housing. He was work and found some kind of work in England, and they were able to save enough money and apply for some kind of political asylum in Canada. So they put their passports, their papers, and all the documents in this envelope, mailed it to some kind of agency in Canada, and their passports were lost. Then plan B was my father found an organization in New York that would help people immigrate based on political asylum. And so with 150 pounds in their pocket, my father, my mother, and my brother flew to New York. They thought they would be greeted by these people that were connected to the organization, but when they landed, nobody was there. I can't imagine that at the time, my mother and father were about 28 years old, landing in the US with broken English and a 5-year-old son, or I think my brother, yeah, was 5 years old, landing in New York with no support. So then, and think about this, no support, that's a theme. Okay. Now, my father and my mother, they were in New York for a while. Again, I don't know the exact what do I call it? The details of how, what happened from the airport, where did they stay? But they were able to find a place where they stayed. And then my father saved up money, bought a VW van, and drove all the way to Houston, Texas, where eventually I was born. So 2 years later, 1979, on June 2nd, I was born. So I was born to immigrant parents. But here's the thing, my parents were undocumented, and my brother as well. So I was already, in a way, talk about a dominant problem, was born into a system that had little support, but also born into a system that was under the radar, that was trying to keep it small, and that was filled with a lot of tension. Now, when my mother was pregnant with me, she was getting already very ill. She started to have headaches. She started to have auditory and visual hallucinations, and she started to get really sick. My father didn't understand what was happening. At the time, they didn't have good health care. I don't think they had health care at all. And my father was getting very nervous, my mother also, and her health started to get worse. Now, she was able to give birth to me reluctantly. And I will be very honest now. Let me preface this with a trigger alert. I will say something that is very triggering, especially around the idea of abortion. So when my mother first found out that she was pregnant with me, she wanted to have an abortion. She did not feel well enough to carry me. Now, my father begged her not to get the abortion, and she decided to keep me. So theme number 2 is not feeling wanted. Now, that's a problem, right? And that's a problem that I've internalized that has later created a lot of different challenges in my own sense of self and personality. Now, my mother had me, and after a year of me being born, my mother got progressively worse. She became more ill, meaning a lot more headaches, intense migraines, visual and auditory hallucinations. So my father took her to the hospital, took her to get evaluated, and they believed that my mother was schizophrenic because of what she was reporting in terms of the auditory and visual hallucinations. So at the time, I was 2 years old, and my mother was in treatment, inpatient, and at the time receiving electric shock therapy. I can't imagine the fear, the loneliness, the sense of helplessness that she was feeling. At the time, she was only 31 years old, and being diagnosed as schizophrenic, having your young child, and young son at home, and my father trying to work. So that's when my grandmother came from Poland to help us. And this is a long story. I didn't expect to tell you like my whole narrative, but this is a part of the dominant story. So as you can hear, there's a lot of problems already connected to my dominant story. So when my grandmother came to help, she was absolutely just appalled by the healthcare system, but especially how my mother was being treated in the inpatient unit. Now, anyone who's listening to this who has been an inpatient, or any therapist that has worked in a hospital and has seen inpatient units, you and I both know that even today in 2024, many people in inpatient facilities are treated in the US like criminals. It is really scary. Any inpatient unit that I've ever been in as a therapist, I have felt this utter fear, right? Not only because of the instability, but this fear, this division between the nurses and the doctors and the patients. You feel that anyone that's inpatient is treated less than human. well, maybe that's a little bit too much to say. And I don't mean I don't mean to create a blanket statement, but many facilities, not all, many facilities, inpatient patients are treated as, as if they're othered, right? They're different. And it's still a problem. So I'm bringing this up. That was something I wasn't planning to, but I am still bringing this up because this is something that needs to be addressed in the US, right? We need to bring more sensitivity and awareness to our healthcare systems, but especially to inpatient units. We need to start to bring a different approach to treating people with severe mental illness. And the World Health Organization has declared that mental health will be one of the leading causes of death 2024 and moving forward. So my dominant story is also connected to many people's dominant stories. And I would say a systemic dominant story where there are a lot of areas of growth and improvement that are needed in our inpatient units. So my grandmother, back to the story, was was appalled by how my mother was being treated. So she decided with my mother that they would go back to Poland against my father's will. They decided not to tell my dad. So by this time, I'm 2.5 years old. My brother is 8.5, almost 9. And my grandmother and my mother decide to kidnap us and go back to Poland. Now, another theme here is secrecy, right? Things that are hidden, things that are not revealed. Secrets, right? A lot of us have secrets in our family that can really make an impact on our sense of self and the way we see the world. So my grandmother and my mother one morning, after my mother had left the hospital, this was, I guess, a couple of weeks or a month after, decided to pack the car, and they drove from Houston, Texas to DC. Now, halfway through, the car broke down. My mother was driving a Pontiac T-Bird, and they spent the night in the motel with my brother and I. I have no recollection or memory of this. And then we boarded what was it called back then? The Greyhound vans. And we went to Washington, DC. Now, at the time, this was 1981. Of course, no cell phones. My dad had come back from work that night. The house was gone. I mean, the house was gone. The kids were gone. Nobody was in the house. And my father panicked. He had no idea where we were. So imagine a week went by. My father still has no clue where we went. My grandmother made sure not to tell any of my mother's friends what the plan was. And my brother, myself, my mother, and my grandmother ended up in a motel in Washington, D.C., as my grandmother was trying to prepare our journey to fly back to Poland. Now, as my brother and I, we were unattended. We were playing in the parking lot of a motel, and the hotel manager asked my brother, "Where's your dad?" And my brother said, "He's at home." And the hotel manager said, "Well, where's home?" "Houston, Texas." So already the hotel manager had a sixth sense that something was off. My mother was in the motel room. My grandmother was taking care of her. We were unattended. At the time, the hotel manager asked my brother, "Do you know your home phone number?" And my brother had memorized it. So the hotel manager called the phone number, and my father happened to pick up. Now, they decided to come up with a plan. My father was able to get a plane ticket that day and fly to DC, and they had come up with a whole plan of how my father would intervene. So the next day, the hotel manager had told my grandmother, "I want to invite you for some sightseeing. I see your kids, your grandchildren are bored. They need to see a little bit of Washington, D.C. Let me take you around." So I have no memory of this. I was 2 years old. The hotel manager, I think, took us to a museum and then took us to the cathedral. When we entered the church, my dad was sitting on a pew. And when my brother and I walked in, my brother said that, we said, "Dad," and we ran to him. My grandmother was very irate, felt tricked, and started to argue with my father. We went back to the motel room, and my father begged my grandmother, "Please come back with us to Houston. Let's figure this out." And my grandmother said no. She said, "You're not allowed to see my daughter. She's sick. She's not feeling well. You've caused her enough stress. You've taken her out of Poland. All of this is your fault. So my father was blamed. My grandmother was blaming my father for my mother's illness. My grandmother firmly believed that it was all the stress that my mother endured, leaving Poland, living in different countries, being an undocumented immigrant, not being able to manage the stress, two children. So that's a huge sense of guilt. So that's another theme in my family. Theme number 3, guilt and blame. Let's name that theme number 4. So we have not feeling supported, not feeling wanted, guilt and blame. These are 4 dominant problems that are often internalized in our family systems. And we take those in. So let me just take a pause here. So that's a lot to intake. All right. That's just the beginning of my life. I'm only 2 years old. There is so much more I can share with you. But I just want to show in terms of childhood trauma and generational trauma, these themes can really impact us. So how have I struggled with these dominant problems? Not feeling wanted. That has been a core wound in all of my relationships, but also my career. Showing up on camera on this podcast is really hard because internally I still struggle with the dominant story that I'm not wanted. You don't want to see me. Who wants to see me? Who wants to hear the story? Yet people from outside have told me people want to hear your story. And you also have a story to hear that people want to hear because we heal and learn and grow through storytelling. But the dominant problem in my head is I'm not wanted. The other dominant problem is feeling that I'm not supported, right? That I don't have the support that I really need. And the other dominant problem is feeling guilt and blame. Oh my gosh, how sensitive I've been my entire life to guilt and blame. Guilt has made an incredible impact on my behavior because I have chosen to do things because I didn't want to feel guilty and I didn't want to be blamed. And often maybe I chose things that were not in my best interest or that limited me in some way or another. So let's go back to the narrative, the dominant story. So my grandmother and my father are arguing. My grandmother says, "You cannot see your mom." And my father decided to swoop me up in his arms, told my brother, "Get in the taxi," and we're leaving. At 2, I never got to say goodbye to my mother. I hope I'm going to be able to continue talking through that call because I'm in such an important part of the story. So I'm just going to take a pause here. At 2 years old, I never got to say goodbye to my mother. My father took us in that taxi. We got on the plane and we flew back to Houston. My mother, the next day, flew back to Poland with her mother. And 3 months later, she died of a brain aneurysm. She didn't have schizophrenia. They misdiagnosed her. She had an aneurysm that was growing, that was there before she was even pregnant with me. And that's another part of the dominant story, right? That misdiagnosis, misinformation. So my mother died April 19th, 1982. I was 2.5 years old. My father was in Houston, Texas, now widowed with 2 young children, a 2.5-year-old and a 9-year-old. And he had to figure it out. And unfortunately, also at the time when my mother was ill, my father was having an affair with our hairdresser. And you can have all the judgment you want because I know I do. But from a compassionate aspect, I also understand that my father was also in crisis. He chose behaviors that were not in alignment with his values, but they were also behaviors that I think that were entwined to his survival. And if my father had not been, if he had not had an affair with our hairdresser, he would not have had the credit card because he used her credit card. Her name was Sam. He used her credit card to book that flight to come get us. So my whole life would be different if my father didn't have that affair. I would have ended up in Poland and would have never probably lived in the US and not even have this life that I'm having right now. Probably would have a different life, but not that it would be bad, worse or better. But it's just incredible how your destiny can be impacted also by tragedy and crisis. So when my father came back and tried to figure things out, he decided to actually marry the woman that he was having an affair with because she was American. And she suggested, why don't we get married? You can become documented and we'll figure it out and I'll help you raise your kids. So another theme, abandonment. I didn't get to say goodbye to my mom, and I never got to see my mom again. Secrecy because her death was not explained to me. And then all of a sudden, this change with this new mom and this stepmom within a year of my mom dying. So it was a lot. And it was a lot for my brother, too. So let's just fast forward a little bit. There's so much to share, but I just wanted to give you just a little sliver of this dominant story that's based on abandonment, that's based on secrecy, that's based on not being enough, etc. Now, I'll just kind of zoom through a big chunk of my life here, and then let's get to where we are today. So my dad married the American stepmom. They were together, but at the time, my father was drinking a lot of alcohol because he didn't know how to manage his grief. He didn't know how to manage his guilt. He didn't know how to manage his hurt and his sorrow because my grandmother continued to blame my father for my mother's death. And I think my father's side of the family also were confused because my father was the only one that left Poland. So they didn't understand, his perspective. So he carried guilt, he carried shame, and he drank alcohol to manage that hurt. So I grew up with a father who was emotionally volatile. When he would drink, he could get angry. When he would drink, he could get very emotional. It was really difficult. Now, that alcoholism really affected his relationship with Sam, my first stepmother. They would argue, they would have huge blown out fights. My father didn't know how to regulate his emotions. My father would also take out his anger and stress on my brother. It was quite toxic and quite difficult. So Sam eventually decided to leave my father. So when I was 6.5, they divorced. And I remember coming home one day to an empty house. She had cleared the house out and left a note. So that sense of sudden loss upon sudden loss upon sudden shock was a lot. Now, I think I also internalized that problem that my stepmother, who didn't know how to regulate her own emotions, I internalized that problem of I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy of a comfortable home. I'm not worthy of belonging. I don't have value. I'm not protected. So I internalized that as not feeling valued, not feeling cared for. And that has been a dominant problem that has impacted a lot of my relationships. Now, moving forward, my father was then single for a while, and still undocumented. So that fear, right? And the pressure of, again, not feeling supported, but also scared. And then finally, under the Reagan administration, my father and my brother were able to be documented under a treaty that President Reagan created, that anyone who had entered the United States before 1979, I believe, I might be getting this wrong, would be granted political asylum. So at the time, my father was still very stressed out as a single parent. A lot of his friends were saying, hey, maybe the problem or the solution to your problem is getting married again. Why don't you marry someone that's Polish, that is a part of your culture? So my father decided to take their advice. Actually met a woman via mail in Poland. They hit it off, and then my father decided to marry her. So stepmother number two. She became quickly pregnant, had a brother. So I have my brother Sebastian, my brother Alex, and then my father's alcoholism was still a problem. Now, that relationship was quite volatile as well because both of them drank. If you can imagine two people drinking alcohol, extremely emotionally unpredictable. So that's another theme, unpredictability, walking on eggshells. You learn how to be a people pleaser. Any environment where you are living with someone who is struggling with alcoholism, you start to anticipate when they're upset. You start to anticipate cues where their behavior changes so that you can protect yourself. So you'll either learn to run away and hide, you'll learn to fawn, to people please, to avoid criticism or any kind of conflict or rejection, or sometimes you'll fight back. So that involuntary response where you run away, you fight, the fight or, flight or freeze, or you'll freeze up and you learn how to shut yourself off from your own emotions, because living in a system where there is alcoholism and unprocessed grief, you learn from watching others that you don't talk about your feelings, that your emotions also are not important, and you internalize that, and that can also impact your relationships, how you see yourself, how you treat yourself, and how you show up in relationships with others, but also how you show up in your career. And through all of this, you can also develop learned helplessness. That's a trauma response, because when you are going through trauma after trauma like I did, you start to feel this sense of helplessness that no matter what I do, no matter how hard I tried to convince my dad, please stop drinking. I remember countless times that I would beg him, crying, Daddy, please stop drinking. Please stop drinking. Don't drink. Don't drink. That it wouldn't change the outcome. His illness had such a grip on him, but so did his unprocessed grief. So did his own sense of shame that he carried and guilt that he carried, because he internalized the guilt. So let me pause. This is a lot to share. So if you've made it this far in the podcast, thank you for listening. I hope this doesn't sound like I've been trauma dumping, but I really wanted to get really raw and vulnerable with you to share how dominant stories can impact us. And then I'm going to eventually get to the part where we can start separating the dominant story. But let me use this as a teaching tool right now. As I've shared this story, these dominant stories, the dominant problem was my mother was ill and she was misdiagnosed. Another problem was that my mother entered the US undocumented and did not have the proper support to help her with medical care or with other areas of her life. The other problem was my father decided to leave Poland and take a huge risk. And the other problem was that his passport got lost, and my mother's passport got lost in the mail, and the people that were supposed to support them in Canada fell through. That was a problem. The other problem was that my mother wasn't able to receive the proper health care to detect the aneurysm before. These are the real problems. But when I internalized the dominant story, when I internalized her early death, when I internalized my sense of abandonment, I created a story around it that I was not wanted, that my mother didn't want me, that I was not valuable, that I did not have any value or meaning. I internalized the burden of being an undocumented immigrant, and the burden of guilt and the burden of grief. I internalized that as a child, and I felt like a burden. There are times still as an adult I struggled with this old dominant story that I feel like a burden. Sometimes I'm scared to ask people for help. Sometimes I'm even hesitant to ask my husband for help because I know he has a stressful job. I know he's tired. But underneath that is my internalized dominant story that I am a burden, that I'm not valuable, that I'm not wanted, that I am a problem. That's the internalized problem. And when you internalize these dominant stories, you can create insecurity. You can create these obstacles in your life that really make it difficult to show up fully and wholly in any relationships. Wholly, like WHOLLY, not HOLY, right? So you start to have a limited idea of who you are based on these dominant problems. So let me just fast forward. So stepmother number 2, that didn't work out. My dad decided to get a divorce with her. Her name was Margaret. Then my father decided to find some kind of work abroad. He attempted to go back to Poland, didn't work. He found this other opportunity to work in a country named Kazakhstan, and he got the job. Now, at the time, I was pretty young. I was 14, 15. He started going back and forth to Kazakhstan. At 15, he decided to stay. Now, that insecurity, right? Him not being clear with me that he was going to move to Kazakhstan also created a deep insecurity of instability. But again, not feeling valued, not feeling wanted, because my father, when he decided to move to Kazakhstan, he chose not to bring me. So my older brother, Sebastian, decided to take care of me per se. Then he decided to go to college. So as he left for college, another form of abandonment, I had a choice. Well, actually, two choices. My father from Kazakhstan said, okay, over the phone, you have a choice. Pick a boarding school in Switzerland, or you can live with your friend, Lisa. I had a friend named Lisa who was an older woman that was kind of like a mom, and I decided to move with her. So I'm living with Lisa. She's having some marital issues, and it became more complicated where she decided to leave. So I left with her. Now I'm 16, living in an apartment with Lisa. I'm a junior in high school, and she decides to go back to her husband. There was so much conflict in that house. I said, I'm just going to stay. So I stayed in this apartment all by myself. And my first stepmother, Sam, found out that I was living alone. So when she found out, she told me, it's illegal for you to live alone. You need to come live with me. So then I moved with her. And as I was living with her, things started to finally feel a little bit normal. My father came to visit from Kazakhstan. I met him in Houston. And while I was visiting him, my stepmother, Sam, found some papers. And the papers that she found was my probation papers. I had got caught shoplifting when I was living with my brother because at the time I wanted some new clothes for Easter. And because my father was in Kazakhstan, my brother was only like 20 years old. I was like, well, if I need clothes, I'll steal them. And I had stolen some clothes with some friends. And one of our friends got caught. I saw it, and then I turned myself in. So I had these juvenile papers. And when my stepmother found them, she kicked me out. She packed all my stuff and all my things in boxes. And when I called her to tell her I was coming back from visiting my dad, she said, don't worry, don't come back. We don't want thieves in our house. I did, or liars in our house. I couldn't understand. I was like, what are you talking about? Because I had kind of basically just blocked it out because I was ashamed. So I remember coming, I asked my dad, you cannot go back to Kazakhstan. You can't get back on your plane tomorrow because I don't know where to live. He still didn't want to bring me to Kazakhstan. So we drove to this small town outside of Houston called Beaumont. We took my boxes and we went back to Houston, and my dad got me an apartment where I lived alone my junior and senior year. Actually was the apartment that my friend Lisa um, had rented, and she still had some few months left. So we just changed the lease, put it under my father's name, and I lived alone my junior and senior year of high school. Now let's talk about dominant problem, the dominant story. I felt so abandoned. I felt so alone, and I felt really pissed off. I felt let down by all the adults in my life. And I remember how lonely I felt. And I remember how frustrated I felt that no one understood how lonely I really was because all of my friends obviously were living with their parents. My father was in Kazakhstan with his new girlfriend. My stepmother had basically decided never to speak to me again. And Lisa was involved with her own marital issues. I felt utterly alone and abandoned and misunderstood. And yet somehow I was determined to prove to the adults around me that I was not a fuck up, that I was not bad. But internally, I felt bad. So let's go back to the dominant story. The dominant problem was I didn't have proper adult support, proper adult supervision. I did not have some of my basic needs being met, right? You know, not being heard, not being seen. And the dominant problem that I internalized again was I'm not wanted. I'm not important. I'm not valuable. I'm not loved. And I also internalized the shame from being caught stealing, right? The shame from doing a wrong thing. And I internalized that I am a bad person. Yet somehow inside of me, I wanted to fight it. I was like, if I get good grades, if I do well in school, maybe that will show that I'm not a bad person. So living alone that junior and senior year, I pushed myself. I got straight A's. I was in the one act plays. I did cross country. I did track and field, and I just excelled as much as I could. And I remember when I finally graduated and started college at the University of Texas, I was like, oh, I'm free from all of the stress connected to my father's choices and to his alcoholism. And I'm free from all the adults that, you know, didn't have their shit together. I'm finally able to start my own life. But what I wasn't aware of is how much I internalized all those dominant problems. I felt so insecure in college. I felt ugly. I felt stupid. I felt not wanted. I felt not valuable. And even though I was still excelling and making straight A's internally, I felt so insecure. And I'm sure whether you're a college student now or you're an adult remembering some of the trauma you experienced as a child or a teenager, or even in college, you can remember how hard it was when you felt so alone, how hard it felt when you felt not loved or not worthy or not important, or you felt let down by the system, or you felt angry at your adults, or you felt angry that you had to figure it out, or you felt angry that you weren't supported, or you felt angry that you weren't seen or heard. Let me just share this moment with you and let me validate all the anger and hurt in you, because I think that is what's really important. We need to validate that angry teenager in us. We need to validate the hurt. We need to validate the suffering that we experienced. It was really hard. It was really hard what you went through. And it was really hard what I went through. But let's not stay stuck there, because some of us are still stuck there. I know there's still parts of me stuck in that trauma. There's still that little 2.5-year-old that is so scared that mommy is sick, that's so scared and sad that she never got to say goodbye to mom. I still have ambivalent and anxious attachment patterns in my relationship with my husband and others. But I don't want that 3-year-old stuck there. I want to bring her back into my life now. So let me start creating a preferred story. Let me start creating a bridge from the dominant story and narrative psychology to the preferred story, the life that you prefer to live, the story that you prefer to tell yourself, the story that you prefer to tell others, that doesn't keep you stuck in an archetype of being the abandoned child or the orphan child or the helpless child or the traumatized child or the violated child or teenager or adult. The dominant story that I told for so long, based on mother loss, based on abandonment, based on betrayal, often put me in this role of being the damsel in distress, of being the helpless one, that I think cognitively, psychologically, and spiritually have kept me stuck, or have impacted the way that other people saw me. And dominant stories can do that to us when we internalize the problem. So why is narrative psychology so powerful? Because when you start to identify the dominant problem and you separate it from your identity, you can start to build confidence and mental and psychological flexibility that will free you and offer you possibilities and opportunities to create a life that's based on what's important to you right now, today. That you can create opportunities for a life that feels good. You can create opportunities for you to show up in your relationships based on an empowered sense of self, not a traumatized, damaged, or wounded self. So let me get back to the preferred story. So for so long, I was telling this dominant story. My mother died when I was 2. My father left me when I was in high school. I lived alone, but I figured it out. I went to college. I became hyper independent. I first studied radio, television, and film. I became a producer. And then when I was a producer, I decided, this feels a lot like being a therapist. I don't want to use people's emotions for entertainment. I want to be able to be a therapist to help people through their difficult times, to help people navigate through their trauma, because I remember how hard it was for me as a teenager when I felt so alone. And so I became a therapist. I got my master's in counseling psychology. I understood the psyche. I dived deeper into the unconscious. I invested in therapy. I went to workshops. I explored spirituality. I got certified in yoga. And I expanded my sense of self. Now, my preferred story is that I have found ways to develop courage. I have found ways to share my pain with others, to help others feel less alone. My preferred story is that I have a master's in counseling psychology and a PhD in family therapy to help others navigate through their own dominant story, to help others feel valued, to feel important. So, with my degree, I am able to live a life that's in alignment with my values. For me, mental health is really important. For me, feeling supported is really important. So, in a way, I've started to change my dominant story, my wounds, into medicine. So, before, when I haven't felt supported, that's become a value for me. Feeling supported is important, and helping others feel supported is important. Helping others feel valued, and me, myself, feeling valued and valuable. If I didn't create a preferred story, I would not have the ability to be speaking to you through this camera. But turning my pain into medicine and turning it into a story that I can share with others and separating my identity from the dominant story. My preferred story is somebody that is resilient. I am a resilient human being. I am someone who's developed empathy and compassion because of what I was exposed to. I am a person that really loves to listen to other people's stories, but really loves to help empower other people. I am a person that loves to be on camera knowing that this can help another person feel inspired, to feel better. I am a person that loves radio, television, film, and documentary filmmaking because I believe in the power of storytelling. I believe in the power of community. So when I didn't feel like I had community, I had internalized that. But separating, the problem was we had limited means, we had limited support. And I've used that now, separating the problem for me, to invest in creating community. This Friday, I'm inviting 10 women to my house from my son's school to be a part of a women's circle. Now, I am afraid of creating friendships with women because of my dominant story of not trusting my stepmoms. But my preferred story is that I want to cultivate meaningful, in depth, caring, loving relationships with women. I want other women to feel inspired and encouraged. Now, I want men too, of course, to feel inspired and encouraged. I want there to be men's groups too. But as a female, I'm cultivating courage and the willingness to create a women's circle here in Geneva. I don't want to use my dominant story, my old problematic story of feeling alone, because I have felt alone here in Geneva. This has been a big move leaving Miami because the last 2 years in Miami, I was finally facing my own demons and saying, I'm not going to use the excuse of being scared of women to not create a community at my son's school. And so the last 2 years before I left Miami, I really went out of my comfort zone to be a part of the PTA, to be a part of the school organization, to spend more time with other moms and mom friends and cultivate relationships. And that was really out of my comfort zone. And so, since moving to Geneva, I am not going to use my old dominant story as an excuse to feel lonely or depressed. I am creating my preferred story that, with my courage, with my sense of value, with my sense of confidence within and my humanity, that I can create relationships with other women and I can create a community here that inspires each other, that supports each other, because we all experience loneliness at one stage or other in our life. We've all experienced at one stage or another some sense of abandonment or betrayal. We've all experienced some sense of guilt or blame. And I'm here to remind you, separate the problem of blame and shame from yourself. So that thing that you might still be carrying guilt about, that thing that you might still be carrying shame about, I want you to acknowledge it right now. The feelings of shame are valid. The feelings of guilt are valid, but you don't have to carry the burden of internalizing that problem. You don't have to continue carrying the burden of negative self-talk, of feeling less than, of feeling unsupported, of feeling lonely, of feeling that it's just too much. You don't have to carry the burden anymore of suicidal ideation or having these, secret fantasies of just relieving yourself from the pain that you're carrying. Separate the dominant story from you. Take this episode, take this moment right now to start imagining, what is your preferred story? What life do you prefer to live? How do you prefer to feel? How do you prefer to feel in your relationships with your significant other? How do you prefer to feel in your body? How do you prefer to feel in your relationship with your children, with your friends? How do you prefer to feel in your career? How do you prefer just to feel in your own skin? That might be a lot to think about. This episode is an invitation for you to think about that. It's an invitation for you to separate the dominant story from who you are. It's an invitation for you to create behavior change with new behavior. So just the thought, engaging in the behavior of thinking, the question, how do I prefer to feel in my body? How do I prefer to show up in this world? How do I prefer to feel in my relationships? Engaging in that question and holding yourself responsible for giving yourself an answer is behavior change. So the next time you catch yourself thinking negatively about yourself, the next time you catch yourself blaming your partner or blaming your children for something, I want you to stop and say, aha, 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 aha. Self-mastery right here in this moment. I'm observing, I'm blaming the other person. Perhaps there's something inside of me that is so painful that I don't want to feel it. So I'm engaging in the behavior of blaming someone else. Let me pause. Let me own this uncomfortable feeling of blame or guilt. And let me separate the problem of blame for who I am and tap into the preferred story. Who do you prefer to be in that moment? In that moment, I prefer to free myself from blame. In this moment, I prefer to hold the other person accountable for their behavior, but I also prefer to hold myself accountable for my behavior. And you start breaking these patterns. The more that you develop the ability to name the problem, separate yourself from the problem, explore a preferred story, hold yourself accountable for new behaviors, sky's the limit. The hardest part, I think, about healing is applying the healing. You can identify the problem, identify the triggers, process the feelings, feel the sadness, feel the hurt, develop this ability to really be more insightful and self-aware. The next challenge is applying the healing. How do you apply the healing? When you get triggered, right? When you get activated, when you get angry, when you get sad, when you get caught up in the story that you start to tell yourself about the situation, and you start to apply all this meaning to the situation. Applying the healing looks like this. Okay, pause. I'm in it. I'm in my dominant story. I'm telling myself a story. I'm storytelling. I'm telling myself a story based on all those old problems. Pause. My feelings are valid. My feelings are valid. My behavior is not always valid. I need to hold myself accountable for my behavior right now. I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to inhale through my nose. I'm going to exhale out. How do I prefer to feel? I prefer to feel peace. I prefer to feel valid. I prefer to feel that my point of view is valid. I can validate my point of view. What I'm feeling is important. What I'm feeling is valid. But blaming the other person is not valid. Judging the other person is not valid. I'm accountable for my own feelings. There's so many other ways to apply the healing. It's not always easy. We sometimes regress back to these old dominant stories, back to these old pain points. We get caught up, but maybe you could think about it this way. The next time you get triggered, the next time you find yourself feeling really angry or really hurt, I want you to pause and say, okay, what old dominant story have I got hooked into again? The next time that you don't feel important in your significant relationship, the next time you don't feel heard, I want you to pause and say, okay, what old story does this remind me of? You go back to that younger version of yourself and you say, I remember how you felt, and what you feel is real, and what you felt back then is real, and what happened is real. But I'm here as an adult to love you, to reparent you. I'm here to help you feel protected, loved, and safe. I'm here to help you feel heard. And maybe your significant other may not understand what you're trying to say, but you take a moment, you say, I understand what I'm trying to say. And maybe my partner is triggered and this is not the best time. We're going to pause. And I'm going to hold myself accountable for this feeling of blame and judgment. And I'm going to ask my partner, can we continue this can we continue this conversation at another time? There's so many other ways to apply the healing. So let's just recap. Narrative psychology. It is a powerful way to separate the problematic story that you've told yourself, about your life. It's important to identify the problem in that dominant story that you've told yourself for so long and that you've told others, so that you can separate your essence, your identity from the problem. You are valuable. Your opinion matters. Your thoughts matter. Your voice matters. How you see the world is unique. Your point of view matters. And even though you might feel alone in this moment, hearing my voice or seeing me on video, I want you to take a moment to know that you are not alone in your feelings. You're not alone in your feelings of feeling betrayed or lonely, frustrated, or insecure. We are human beings trying to figure it out. But I do believe you and I have something in common. We have the courage and the willingness to start creating new cycles within ourselves. You and I have the courage and the willingness to connect to ourselves on a much deeper level. You and I have the courage and the willingness to not only connect to ourselves on a deeper level, but to start to show up in our relationships in a more present way, to start to show up in our relationships in a preferred way. You and I have the willingness and the courage to create new relationships with others, to apply this healing that we're learning, to share this self-mastery that you're developing with others in your life. You have the courage and the willingness to share your story with someone else so that someone else can feel just a little less alone in this world. And I believe you have infinite possibilities ahead of you. I believe there's so much that you have, so much goodness that you have to share with this world. And I thank you for listening to this very long podcast that has an insight view of some of the trauma that I've experienced as a child, that has some inside perspective of how to separate the dominant story from our preferred story. And I feel so humbled to show up in this world as a therapist, as a coach. I feel so humbled to be able to show up on this podcast. And I feel so humbled, deeply humbled, that you would take your precious time to even listen to this podcast, because it's a lot. It's a lot that I shared. And maybe you'll listen to this podcast in different segments. So wherever you land, I just want to say thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, because you and I right now in this moment are creating community and we're creating connection. And you and I are creating human connection right now. And we need more human connection in this world. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Join me for my next episode on the Dr. Sylvia K Show. You can find me on Spotify, on Apple TV, on Apple Podcast. And I just want to say thank you again. Until next time, bye for now.